Hello viewers and welcome to the session on Tribal Discourse in Social Sciences. This is taken from the coursework BSW 041, which is from the Certificate in Tribal Studies, and we are going to talk about understanding the tribals, within which you have taken a subtopic that is Tribal Discourse in Social Sciences. Now that you are listening to us and watching us, you'd be thinking, what does this program entails? So for your understanding, we'll tell you that from this session, what you can expect is we will tell you about the objectives of the program. We will give you a short introduction as to what tribal discourse in social science is all about, and then we will talk in detail about the policy of isolation in pre-independence period, the policy of assimilation, policy of integration in post-independence period, and contemporary debates and the policy of neglect that has been happening. Now, without any further ado, let us go on to the objectives. Now, this session is going to help you to understand how the issues of tribal development have been approached. And it will also help to bring together numerous studies to present a coherent view on tribal development and form a narrative on tribal discourse. The session will also help to examine the theories developed by social scientists, anthropologists, and policymakers on issues related to tribal development. Also, it will help to locate the wider debates on inclusion and exclusion of the tribes from the larger section of the society. Now, why do we signify in talking about the tribals? This is because we know that in our contemporary societies, the reservation of the tribals and attention to the tribals have been given more focus. And in order to understand why are we giving them attention, or why are we calling them as a vulnerable section of the society, it is also important to understand the history that is surrounding the tribals, so that the justification of the reservation, justification to the vulnerability aspect of these tribals are well proven. Now, let us go to the introduction. The scheduled tribes. Everyone know that there's a vulnerable sections or the categories of people that are known as the ST, SC, OBCs, that is the scheduled tribes, the scheduled castes, and the other backward castes. Now, what exactly is the scheduled tribe? The scheduled tribes comprise a substantial indigenous minority population of India. They consist of almost 700. Now, this is taken from the annual report of the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and now the number has increased. Now, there are more than 700 tribal groups, and among them, 80% live in the central belt, existing from Gujarat and Rajasthan in the west, and across the state of Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, Jharkhand, and Odisha to West Bengal and Tripura in the east. Now, the northeastern state, which constitute almost 20% of the tribal population, is one of the major areas where the scheduled tribe is present. Apart from the central India that we just talked about, the northeast state, that is the 8 northeast states of India, we have the tribal population existing them, and we all know what states are there. And among the southern states, we have Andhra Pradesh, which has the largest tribal population. So this is in short a detailed, a brief aspect about these scheduled tribes. Now, when we talk about the scheduled tribes, you know the numbers, almost 18% of the population are the scheduled tribe, consists of the scheduled tribes, and they are everywhere from the central to the north, south, east, west, and most of the major population of the scheduled tribes are in the northeastern state of India. Now, who are the scheduled tribes? If you look at the history, people who have their own habitation, who lives in the forest, who have their own culture, tradition, customs, are considered to be people who are belonging to the scheduled tribe. As the name suggests, tribes, which is homogeneous to tribals, they have a specific beliefs, specific culture, and specific tradition, and that is why we call them as tribes. Now, the tribes of India have been undergoing process of incorporation and separation into the wider community. This is more so because before the independence, there were tribals living in the soil of India. However, not many knew about them, and there were a lot of debates and confusion as to where they belonged to, and therefore there was an opportunity to assimilate them into the larger section of the society, and that is why we have this undergoing process of incorporation, at the same time separation into the wider community. The process has been a result of poverty, exploitation, and underdevelopment among the tribal communities. With the very low rate of literacy, combined with acute and abysmal poverty, the tribes have been majorly located outside the larger Indian society. And this is exactly why we feel that when we talk about the tribal society, assimilation of the tribal society into the mainstream community, or talking about incorporating them into the wider society is of an important aspect, and we have to consider them as being a major population in the Indian society and give them certain benefits. Now, this has led to a debate on what approach to adopt with regard to the tribal development. The discourse on tribal development in India has been shaped by two interrelated issues. And what are they? First, how to percolate the fruits of development and eradicate poverty among the tribal populations. And second, relates to effects of socio-cultural integration of the tribals as citizens of the nation state and protection of 27 of tribal language, custom and culture. So there was a debate among with the government as to how to protect them or how to assimilate them into the wider society. Now, these two issues have occupied center stage of the policy making related to the tribal development. The discourse on the development of the tribals could be studied in 4 phases. Now, what are these 4 phases? When you talk about the phases, it is also important as a learner of the certificate in tribal studies to understand these 4 phases. So let us go into these phases one by one. Now, policy of isolation or leave them alone approach adopted in pre-independence period by the British. So as the name suggests, policy of isolation. You isolate them from the mainstream community. It was developed by the British during their reign in pre-independence period. Now, why is this isolation needed, or why did the British adopt this isolation policy? This is primarily because they were uncertain of the kind of people the tribal were, and they did not know how to cater to their needs and to their demands, and they weren't sure as to from where they've come. So there was a lot of history going around the tribal population. Now, second phase is the policy of assimilation or detribalization, which is approach of G.S. Gurria, one of the sociologists who have mentioned these two things. Now, these two issues have occupied center stage of the policy making related to tribal development. The discourse on the tribal development could be studied again in 4 phases. Now, with these phases, the other 3 phases, the first 2 phases that we have talked about is a policy of isolation and of assimilation, and now we talk about policy of integration and development adopted soon after independence. Now, this approach is associated with Jawaharlal Nehru, the then Prime Minister of India. So he was really associated with the tribal issues, and it was close to his heart, and he wanted to talk about the tribal issues. So the policy of integration, which was associated with Jawaharlal Nehru period, and the 4th phase that we talked about is the contemporary debate on the neglect of tribes. So in order to rephrase, we have the first phase when we talk about the 4 phases that needs to be understood. When we have the discourse on tribal development, the first phase is the policy of isolation or leave them alone theory, which was made by the Britishers during the pre-independence period. Then we have the policy of assimilation. Then we have the policy of integration and development, which was adopted by the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And then we have the contemporary debate on the neglect of tribes. So these were the 4 phases that we talked about. So now let us go into these phases one by one. The first phase, as we mentioned, was the policy of isolation or leave them alone, which was taken up by the British period, during the British period in the pre-independence period. So what is this policy of isolation all about? Now, the term Adivasis and tribes highlight the secluded character of the tribal communities. The colonial policy of exclusion of tribal areas was largely an outcome of the work of ethnographers, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and Christian missionaries studying tribal cultures in India. Now, when we look at the contribution of the sociologists, ethnographic and anthropologists, and especially the missionaries in India with the tribals, we see that they have given a lot of enterprising results in regards to tribal study, and that has allowed the tribals to become a part of the mainstream society. Now, this policy of isolation, one of the most important work includes that of Verrill Elwin. He was very close to the then Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and through his sociological studies and theories that was formulated for the tribal studies, a lot of aspect or a lot of beliefs or a lot of myths regarding the tribals were debunked by his studies. So Elwin's study on Bega, which was taken way back in the year 1939, made him realize that exploitation of these tribes was severe, and this community hopes to have a Bega Raj, that is where they have their own ruler and no interference and exploitation by the others. This study led Elwin to adopt leave them alone or national park approach or isolation approach. So which primarily meant that when the study was undertaken, Elwin realized that the tribals do not want to be associated with any kind of society, or in fact they do not want to be mainstream into any kind of society, and that is the reason why he adopted this policy of leave them alone, or the policy of isolation that we rightly call it. Now, what happened with this study was that Elwin's national park policy, or of keeping the tribals as museums specimens, became the model for administration. So what happens is the administration, the government of India during that time left them alone, but did not have nothing to do with them, and so the British adopted two broad approaches on tribal development during that time. Now, the first approach advocated by the British was to isolate tribes from the larger society and therefore separate tribal areas from the purview of normal administration. As the name suggests, policy of isolation. They are away from the purview of administration, so they do not come directly under the administrative procedures, which was then led by the British government. So they have their own system of control, they had their own system of administration. Practically, the policy of isolation adopted by the British further alienated the tribals living on more than 28 hills in the forest and in remote areas. Now, the current lack of development among the tribals needs to be understood in this historical perspective. And that is why we keep on saying that when we talk about reservations being given to the scheduled tribe, a scheduled tribe being called as a vulnerable population, or giving advantage to the scheduled tribe people, it is important to understand the historical perspective as to where this tribal comes from, how were their living pattern, how were they under the administration, so on and so forth, for us to justify these kind of reservation. So rightly said, the current lack of development of these tribals needs to be understood in this historical perspective. Herein what we mean is the policy of isolation, where they were isolated during the pre-independence period. Now, going further, the second point of view saw tribes as animus. Now, animus, we mean that they did not believe in any kind of a living God. They believed in nature worship, they believed in deity, they believed in ancestor worship. So on the ground that they belonged to a religious tradition other than that of any major religions of India. Thus, they were a society unto themselves and constituted a society different from the larger society. And hence the reason why the British government did not place them under their own administration, and they had their different administration, more so primarily because they had their own cultures, they had their own tradition, and they were animist in nature. So it was pertinent, or it was prudent of the British government to not bring them under the purview of their own administration. Now, continuing with the policy of isolation in the pre-independence period, the concept of protecting the tribal community from too rapid integration into economy and polity was born out of the direct nature of the British rule. It was a product of calculation on the part of British on two major issues. So how did this protecting the tribals come about under the British rule? This has two major issues. Now we will understand what are the two major issues. The first one is administration of the far-flung tribal areas would be difficult. So when the British government, during their reign in India, they were located mostly in the north, south, east, west or central part, and excuse me, they did not have any knowledge or idea of how to administer the tribal population, and most of these tribal population were living in far-flung areas. When we talk about far-flung areas, it is mostly the hills and the mountains, and that is the reason why the British government felt that it would be impossible for them to administer them, and so they realized that administrating these tribals in the far-flung area would be difficult. And the second major issue as to why the concept of protecting the tribals came about is that isolation would keep tribals away from political movement which was developing at that point of time. So the lesser the problem, the lesser the people, the lesser the problem. So for the British government also, there were a lot of political movement that was going around in India, and if the tribal population would have to join in that movement, maybe just maybe the British government would be at a greater disadvantage. So they decided that protecting the tribals or isolating them from the purview of the administration was a much better idea than keeping them near or mainstreaming them into the society. And again, it has been repeated that because of these kind of historical aspect, the historical perspective, it is important to understand why these scheduled tribes or the tribal people have been given reservations or having given special protection by the government, by the current government. Now, within the larger framework, again, of the policy of isolation, legislations were enacted. Now, for instance, the British promulgated Inner Line Regulation in the year 1873 that aimed to minimize tribal and non-tribal contact by controlling tribal industries and trade in the tribal areas of the Northeast. So this Inner Line regulation, or in today's term like we call the Inner Line Permit, is a kind of a restrictions or a boundary that has been placed in and around the tribal states where unless and until you have the permission, you cannot enter into these tribal boundaries. And that is the reason why trade and industries have also been restricted in order to safeguard the interests of the tribal population. Now, the protection and the preservation of the tribal life and culture were also ensured by the enactment of the Scheduled District Act, which was initiated in the year 1874, and that provided for special tribal administration. Now, what is this special tribal administration? Now, this Scheduled District Act of 1874, which provided special tribal administration, is allowing or providing a provision to the tribals to have their own set of administration. So they do not come under the direct purview of the government which was existing there. And that is why they have the special administration, special tribal administration, where they form their own rules and regulation, and they have been governed by that special tribal administration for a very long period of time. Now, within this framework, by implementing the Act of 1919, the reconstructions of the tribal areas into backward tracts was made. So this also provided another provision for empowering the tribal population. Now, within this, we have a lot of other aspects. That is, this backward tracts that we just talked about were divided into two types. Now, what are the types? The first included those backward areas excluded from the scope of reformed legislatures and the constitutional reforms. The second type of the backward areas included those areas that were represented in the legislatures, but the representation was neither effective nor adequate. So these backward tracts, if you have to have your own opinion, you could say that it was just for the name's sake, it was just to appease the tribal population, but there was nothing much in concrete that could be seen. So that is one aspect. And also by the Act of 1935, the provision of the previous Act were made more stringent by converting the backward tracts into areas of total or partial exclusion. So these kind of acts again provided the opportunities for the tribal to come back into the mainstream or to be seen or heard by the government. Now this helped the British to achieve twofold objectives: secluding the tribes from the larger society in the aspiration of the freedom movement, and second, it further restricted the process of development among the tribes. So when you talk about restriction of the development among the tribes, what we can see is that when a certain population is being under the dictator government, or when an authoritarian government or a leader is governing over a large sections of the population, you do not want that population to become developed. You do not want that population to be educated, because once people become educated, they start asking questions, they start asking for reasons, for justification, and so that will only lead to the downfall of the government or the British Empire, and that is the reason why they did not want the development of the tribal population. Now, going further ahead into that, as a result of the isolation approach, even though the tribal areas remain uninterrupted, the enactment of legislations like India Forest Act of 1878 and Land Acquisition Act of 1894, establishing absolute propriety of the colonial state over the forest land, led to massive discontent among the tribals and resulted in rebellions in various parts of India. The policy of isolation did nothing for the welfare and development of the tribals. So this is more or less a kind of a reason why there was a lot of uprising among the tribal population because of this act, and they were not pleased and they were not satisfied because of this policy of isolation. And this isolation further bridged the gap between the mainstream society and the tribal population. Now, having talked about this policy of isolation, where the tribals feel that they have been not justified in terms of mainstreaming them or providing them with different developmental measures, or not including them under the purview of the administration, there's another segment that we will be talking about, that is the policy of assimilation. And as the name suggests, a policy of assimilation is assimilating them, including them in certain aspect. Now, let us understand and learn what this is all about. Policy of assimilation. Now, Gurria, who's a sociologist, argued that Hindu castes have been in a symbiotic relationship with tribes since ancient times, and they both remain intrinsic parts of the Indian civilization, which British wanted to break by their isolationist approach. So, we all know that history taught us that when the British ruled over India, they followed the policy of divide and rule. Similarly, when a tribal population were a part of the larger society, they also wanted to bring in the divide and rule policy and isolate both the tribals and the larger section of the Hindu population. Now, Gurria's writing on tribes, that is one of the names, the Aborigines, so-called, and their future, made a case for the complete assimilation of the tribes with rest of the Indian population. Now, Gurria was of the opinion that it is misleading to call the tribes as Aborigines, as they were actually only backward Hindus, and the solution to the economic, culture and social problem lay in the overall assimilation of the tribals into the Hindu society. So now this is another aspect where we can say that when the tribals were considered to be a larger part of the Hindu society, the British government would want to separate each of these because then there would be an uprising, or there would be a lot of other contentions that we as of now might not know, or there'll be a lot of historical aspect when we dwell into it. Now, within this aspect, Gurria also argued that Hindu caste, based on this argument, like when we talk about assimilating the tribals into the Hindu society, this argument, which was given by Gurria, who's one of the major sociologists, divided the tribes into three sections. And what are these sections? The first one is those who are properly integrated, that is, who comes under the purview of the Hindu society. Second is loosely integrated, the one who have been or have not been. They have been integrated on a very loose scale, and those not touched by Hinduism. So within this, the third point, we have a lot of contentions which talks about the people who've not been touched by Hinduism, where the Christian missionaries played a very important role in their development or empowerment. But that is again a discussion for another session, and we would not be touching that too much in detail. But the three aspect or the three sections where divided is those who are properly integrated, second, those who are loosely integrated, and third, those who are not touched by Hinduism at all. Then the approach was criticized on the fact that complete assimilation is difficult. It would be difficult for the tribals to give up their traditional tribal belief, practices, and ideas. Now, this is the reason why we talk about the policy of assimilation, where Guria mentioned that, yes, the tribals need to be assimilated because of certain aspect. This is in the part. Now we'll take a short break, and after the break, we'll come back and continue with the policy of assimilation. Thank you.
Do you know that the world's population has reached 8 billion on 15th November 2022? And we are still counting. I don't know where do we go from here. The predictions are scary. Any idea how many people can Mother Earth sustain? India's growing population is a serious concern, and we are soon going to become the world's most populous country. Wow, number one. Population is, after all, a human issue. The UN proposed Sustainable Development Goals cannot be achieved unless and until we consider the population dynamics. So, here we are. Indira Gandhi National Open University offers appreciation course on population and sustainable development. The course explores the linkages between population and sustainable development. In this course, there are diverse issues related to population, environmental safety, livelihoods, human health, migration, urbanization, and much more. The course duration is 3 months, but of course, you can complete it within a year. The eligibility of the course is graduation from a recognized university. So, if you are a development professional, working in a government sector, researcher, or keen to know more about the population and sustainable development, the course is must for you. Hurry up and join this course so that we are able to convert population into demographic dividend and not convert it into demographic disaster. For more information, visit www.ignou.ac.in. Thank you.
Hello learners, and we shall continue with the session. Before going for a short break, we were talking about the policy of assimilation. Before that, we were touching on the topic of policy of isolation, which was given by the British government during the pre-independence period. And this is all related to the topic Tribal Discourse in Social Sciences, which is coming from Certificate in Tribal Studies BSW 041. Now, continue with our topic, that is the policy of assimilation. We were talking about how assimilation of the tribals was important and necessary, and why it was given by Gurrier, the important sociologist. Now, assimilation of tribals into dominant sections of society would lead to a situation of caste conflict, as non-tribal caste society is based on the principle of homo hierarchicus, whereas the tribal live in the society that is based on the principle of equality or egalitarianism. So this is simply put, the normal general population, they have this hierarchical order, and we all know that we have different categories of the general society that we live in, and where we have the touchables and untouchables and all. However, within the tribal society, they have a egalitarianism society where everybody is equal. So if we assimilate them into the major society or mainstream them into the society, it might lead to a problem situation. It was widely recognized that the tribal socio-economic structures, culture, and value systems were completely different from the other non-tribal sections of the society, and therefore any attempt to force assimilation in long run would lead to serious repercussions. In this sense, policy of assimilation is seen as having aggressive and violent overtones. Now, this is simply put that when you talk about a certain population that has been living in seclusions for a long period of time, you've been isolating them for a long period of time because of certain aspect. Suddenly to talk about assimilating them and not understanding what problems could creep in would be a major disaster, and that is why we mentioned that it could have violent overtones. Now, talking about the policy of integration in post-independence period, it is important to understand that the need to evolve a more comprehensive approach for tribal development soon after independence came to be widely recognized, because at the end of the day, the tribal population who are a part of India can always have a major role or impact the entire society somehow or the other. Now, contrast with British policy, the government of India's primary focus was the overall development of the tribals, and they made a lot of effort in regards to understanding the tribals, assimilating them into the larger society, or as we call it, mainstreaming them into the larger society. Now, why is this given importance? Whether to isolate or assimilate the tribes into the process of development came to be widely debated in the Constituent Assembly. As the Government of India Act 1935, framed by the colonial state, formed the model for independent India, it was widely accepted that the Constituent Assembly debates were to be based on colonial propositions. Now, the propositions of the colonial government was of isolating the tribals. However, the present government in the post-independence period wanted to assimilate them. Now, during the Constituent Assembly debates, three important groups debated on the strategy of the tribal development. The assimilationists favored the absorption of the tribal society into the larger dominant society. The liberals argued for self-autonomy for the tribals. Continuing with this, the Constituent Assembly set up a subcommittee under the chairmanship of Thakkar Bappa. The most important finding of the subcommittee related to the establishment of welfare and development of the tribals. The policy of integration, that is, policy to integrate the tribal society into the national mainstream, gradually was concretized by Jawaharlal Nehru. As we mentioned while we were talking about this aspect, Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the most important figure who was eminent in mainstreaming the tribals into the mainstream society. Now, the Scheduled Areas and Scheduled Tribes Commission endorsed and elaborated the policy of integration as attempting not to disturb the harmony of tribal life and simultaneously work for its advancement, not to impose anything upon the tribals, and simultaneously work for their integration as members and part of Indian family. Now, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru did not favor permanent isolation of the tribes from the mainstream civilization, but suggested their protection from exploitative nature of the larger Indian society. So at the same time, what happened was the government realized the importance of the tribal population. So they wanted to mainstream them, but it had to be a gradual process because they did not want the exploitative nature of the larger Indian society to percolate down into the peaceful life of the tribals. Now, after independence, the struggle of the Nagas for independence came to be viewed as a struggle for land, nationality, and cultural autonomy. These developments transformed the outlook of Nehru towards the tribe and solved their problems through the policy of integration, which was a setback, but however, probably it was a realization later on that everybody would want a piece of their land. However, the struggle by the Nagas gave Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru another reason as to why would they want to solve the tribal problems. Now, integration needs to be distinguished from assimilation. And while assimilation is partial and involuntary subservience, integration, in contrast, is a respectful merger with the mainstream, staking a claim to an equal share of power and resources as citizen. Now, when you talk about this assimilation and when you talk about the changing pattern of or the change in the outlook of Pandit Nehru in terms of protection of these tribals, it is important here to understand the Nehru Panchsheel or the Panchsheel that has been given by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, he has been, as mentioned, a very important and pertinent figure in developing or bringing about the overall development of the tribals and providing opportunities for the mainstreaming of these tribals. Now, let us go and understand what is Nehru Panchsheel. Now, going back, Nehru spelled out as his Panchsheel of 5 cardinal principles concerning the government's attitude towards the tribals in order to prevent their exploitation and in order to preserve their identity and culture from the big general Indian population and to bring about the development. So the first one is, people should develop along the lines of their own genius, and we should avoid imposing anything on them. We should try to encourage in everywhere the tribal's own tradition, arts, and culture. Secondly, tribal rights in land and forest should be respected. Third, we should try to train and build up a team of their own people to do the work of administration and development. And also, we should not over-administer these areas or overwhelm them with multiplicity of schemes. We should rather work through and not in rivalry to their social and cultural institutions. And fifth, we should judge results, not by statistics of the amount of money spent, but by the quality of human character that is involved. So these are the 5 Panchsheel that has been given by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in order to preserve the culture and identity and also for the overall development of the tribals. Now, Nehru's development policy came to be seen as based on the value of gradualism and passive interference of the state alongside all other philanthropic overtones. In accordance with the policy of integration, 43 sub-multi-purpose projects were established and a committee appointed under the chairmanship of Elwin to examine the programs of these blocks. Further, a Debar committee was appointed in 1960 to report on the administration of the scheduled areas. Now, the tribal development has been based on 2-pronged approach. The first one is the promotion of development activities to raise their level of living, and second, protection of their interests through legal and administrative support. Several provisions conforming to the principles came to be adopted in the constitutions for the upliftment of the tribal societies. Government of India made it practical through constitutional guarantees under the 5th and 6th schedules of the Indian Constitution. The Constitution came to include several provisions for tribes, including proportional representation in legislatures, right to use their own language, culture and customs, provision of reservation for educational and job opportunities. The tribal sub-plan adopted from the 5th five-year plan onwards is a major instrument of socio-economic development for the tribals. The main objective of the tribal sub-plan was to bridge the development gap between the tribes and non-tribal communities and to improve the quality of life of the tribal people. Now, let us look at this snippets. If you concentrate on the screen here, there's a small snippet that has been given. Let us understand. The Nehru-Elwin policy followed in first decade of independence came under severe criticism as it was widely recognized that the administration of the northeastern tribal areas was not satisfactory and that there was too much focus on the political and administrative development while the economic development of tribes was ignored. Panchsheel was in disagreement with the policy of industrialization for the rest of India. Since tribal areas are also the most resource-rich areas, the process of industrialization was brazen with regard to tribal rights on land, water and forest. And the Nehruvian approach could not retain its inclusive zeal, and most of the development programs introduced by Nehru caused massive displacement among the tribals. Now, if you look at it again, we see that when you talk about a certain policies and programs that has been introduced, not everything would make sense or not everything would be advantageous to a lot number of people. However, we also know that the approach also came to be criticized on the ground that there remain gaps between the developmental model and the protection policy for the tribals. The Nehru-Elwin policy of gradual integration was replaced by the policy of progressive politico, economic and cultural integration of the tribal people in order to speed up the socio-economic development. In order to achieve this, Government of India pursued the agenda of modernization of backward tribal areas. Now, in this, it really helped the tribal population to become a part of a developed state or to be considered one among the mainstream society. Now, after having talked about the policy of isolation, policy of assimilation, policy of integration post-independence period, let us understand the kind of debates or the contemporary debates and the policy of neglect that has been doing the rounds. Now, with the onset of liberalization era in 1980s, the Government of India further enhanced its support to the tribal areas. Within the ambit of developmental model, the subsequent government pursued the policy of earmarking funds to the tribal regions to address the problems of underdevelopment and improving system of governance. Now, the 6 five-year plans envisaged a fourfold policy for the tribal development. And what are they? Let us read it. Integration of the services at the delivery point of beneficiary, development of the service from the bottom upwards, development of the skills to diversify occupations, and introduction of the latest technology based on local materials and local skills. So this is the fourfold policy which was envisaged for tribal development. Now, there are certain arguments in regard to these policies as well. What are they? There have been general agreement among the scholars studying tribal development that the Indian state has failed to bring basic structural transformation among the tribal communities as envisaged. Major problems the tribes face today relate to distortion introduced in the socio-economic life due to recent economic development. The ever-increasing interaction of tribals with the non-tribals have led to increasing exploitation and discrimination of the tribes, and the reservation have benefited few tribal communities by providing them with jobs. Apart from these sets of arguments, there are a lot more of arguments. That is, development-induced development has become a major human rights issue as it has resulted in marginalization of tribal families. The state has been indifferent to these problems that have led to emergence of dependence and disadvantage among the tribes. So we all know that if there's a certain things happening, then there will always be an argument in relation to that advantage or that development policies. So these are some of the arguments, among which is also the process of decentralization has expanded the scope of tribal participation in politics. But land alienation, migration, educational backwardness and indebtedness continue to remain major obstacles for their development. Also, the argument states that the new economic regime has led to privatization and marketization of economy and has been treated as a powerful threat for the tribal communities. Why so? Because most of the tribal communities, when we talk about it, who have been dwelling in the forest areas and all, for them the economy is still slow. So the purchasing power of these tribal communities is less. So when you talk about globalization, marketization or modernization, then it has to relate to their economic power, which definitely is unfortunately low for the tribal communities. Now, among all these arguments, we have still other arguments, and one of them is the scheduled tribe continue to suffer from all the disadvantages associated with the ethnic minority community, and also that the forces of globalization have posed renewed threats to the livelihood of one of the most marginalized sections of the Indian community. Now, when you talk about all this, it is definitely an understanding that the economy or the purchasing power of the tribal population would definitely not be in par with what the general population have already have. So several cases of tribal destitution and loss of access to land and livelihoods have been coming from the state of Orissa and West Bengal, to mention a few. The first colonial British state, which is the forest policy, which was enacted in 1894, and then independent India, the forest policy enacted in 1952, have laid bare vast tracts of forest and turned them into agricultural land, impoverishing and subordinating the population, which is among the tribal population. Now, in regards to all these aspects, we also see that the development of the tribals have been given a lot of importance, and the government of India have made a lot of effort in order to bring about the development of the tribals. And we also have discussed the kinds of arguments that have risen in regards to what the efforts made by the government. So if you look at all these arguments at the same time, it is pertinent that some of these has to be understood in terms of why the development of the tribals cannot happen in full as envisaged by the government, because there are certain issues that are associated which would not really allow them to come up in a very fast pace. So these kind of development has to be gradual, has to be slow, and allowed a momentum of understanding and development by the tribals themselves. Now, within this aspect, we have few other arguments, and that is when we talk about the state continues to face difficulties in protecting the tribal culture, which form the main principle of policy of integration. Now, there are a lot of arguments in regard to this development, and which you can definitely go through the course content in BSW 041. A lot of arguments have been given, and just for your understanding, I've been pointing them out for this presentation here. Now, in order to understand what we have done in this session, I will go to the conclusion, and I would like all of you to pay attention. In the session, we discussed the development of tribal discourse in India. Now, as mentioned, this is coming from the Certificate in Tribal Studies, BSW 041. Now, the tribal discourse has been understood in 4 phases. In the pre-independence period, policy of isolation was adopted that focused on keeping the tribals away from the dominant non-tribal society. The policy of isolation came to be criticized by the policy of assimilation, which is also an important discourse on tribal development. The shortcomings of policy of isolation and policy of assimilation came to be recognized by the policy makers in independent India, who envisaged a policy of integration for the tribes. Now, the policy of integration, unlike policy of isolation and policy of assimilation, focused on integrating the tribes with larger sections of society in the process of development. The policy of integration, however, fell short in meeting its objectives. Of late, the discourse on the tribal development centers on issues of development of tribal identity resulting from continued exploitation, indebtedness, and development-induced displacement and land alienation. Now, in continuation, what we have done in today's session is on the discourse of tribal studies is the tribal identity has been shaped on two issues: integration of the tribals into the nation state and the larger sections of the society, and the assimilation into the Hindu fold. The debate is still ongoing. The integration approach adopted by independent India has its own limitation. As a result, the tribes continue to face socio-economic deprivation. In recent times, there has been emergence of movements among the tribes based on identity and revolving around the issues of livelihood. Now, this emergence has to be understood in the context of isolation, assimilation, and integration that define the relationship of the tribes with respect to the state at various points of time. It is the last and continuing phase of neglect where the tribes benefited from the reservation and other policies have questioned and staged a revolt against the state. Now, in all these aspects, from the beginning till the end, we have covered the tribal discourse in social sciences, and I hope that you have been listening well and you have enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.
Hello friends, I am Harish Kumar Tyagi, reader, Amity Institute of Education, Amity University, Uttar Pradesh. Today, dear learners, we will learn about the constitutional provisions in Indian constitutions made to education. After going through this lecture, you will be able to understand the concept of fundamental rights and duties, directive principles, and various provisions made in constitutions to provide education. We have to know what is constitution. So, we can say a constitution can be defined as a set of fundamental principles and established precedents according to which a country is governed. These principles and precedents may be written or unwritten, brief or detailed, optional or obligatory for the government of the country. Concept of constitutional values is like this, that values are the special features and provisions which are fundamental to it. Some of these are mentioned in its preambles as objectives of the constitution, whereas the other